Essential question 3 is, in what ways did the boundaries of American freedom grow narrower in this period? The first thing to focus on here are the new immigrants, which we brought up in the last chapter, but we're going to focus on in some depth here. The new immigrants, or these immigrants, millions of them in fact, from southern and eastern Europe, places like Italy, Russia, Greece, Poland, etc., who were coming in the late 1800s, faced a new wave of nativism, or opposition to immigration. These new immigrants were typically poor, they were typically unskilled workers, and they were oftentimes willing to work for lower wages than were Americans who were already in the country. They were considered by nativist Americans oftentimes to be to be lesser races who were more prone to criminality. And you have organizations form, or nativist organizations formed to oppose immigration, such as the Immigration Restriction League, which formed in the 1890s, who called for laws that would reduce immigration. On the West Coast, Chinese immigrants faced nativism as well. Remember that Chinese migrants had initially come into the United States during the California Gold Rush in 1848, then moved into railroad construction and Californian agribusiness. And they were victims of that typical nativist fear of quote-unquote American jobs being taken away by foreigners who were willing to work for lower wages. In this case, nativism resulted in a law that actually did restrict immigration, and this is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, which, as the name implies, prohibited Chinese immigration to the United States. And this is very notable because it's the first law in U.S. history to exclude a specific group based on their ethnic background. Also worth noting here, of course, is that Chinese workers and people of Chinese descent in the West face discrimination and oftentimes violence. In terms of African Americans, we focused on the plight of Southern African Americans in the last question. Here, to look at African Americans more nationally in a more general sense, we want to look at two African American social thinkers. The first one being Booker T. Washington, who in the late 1800s offered a new vision of African American freedom. In 1895, Booker T. Washington gave his so-called Atlanta Compromise speech, which encouraged African Americans to seek economic opportunities rather than political rights. The idea being that African Americans needed to prove their economic worth before being deserving of political rights, which had really been granted to them already through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He even essentially accepts segregation, where in his speech he says, quote, "In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress," end quote. The idea being that we can be separate through segregation, but we can all work together for economic progress for all. Booker T. Washington stressed the importance of vocational education, which means like job training, and economic self-help. And he very much opposed public political agitation against discrimination. And he's very complex in what his motivations are. Keep in mind that he opposed political agitation because he feared a backlash against African Americans, and he's probably right in this case, considering the spectacle lynchings and the violence that African Americans already faced throughout parts of the South. They could very likely expect a white backlash if they publicly agitated for, say, an anti-lynching law or a civil rights bill or something like that. Booker T. Washington really reflected very limited goals for African American freedom rather than broad reform. And I want to take a moment here to compare Booker T. Washington to another contemporary thinker named W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was very much the opposite of Booker T. Washington in terms of the vision for African American freedom that he promoted. He was an advocate for immediate equal rights for African Americans, arguing that African Americans had already received equal rights with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or those Reconstruction Amendments that we talked about before. And this is obviously different than the gradualism of Washington, who thought that African Americans needed to prove their worth and work toward equality. W.B. Du Bois was also a founding member of the NAACP in 1909, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he advocated for intellectual development and broad education rather than the purely vocational education that Washington advocated. We'll talk about Du Bois a little bit more during the Progressive Era, but when talking about Du Bois, you always want to talk about Booker T. Washington as well, and vice versa. These two are opposite sides of the same coin, and they should be used on the APUSH exam whenever you use them as a kind of dialogue back and forth, as a kind of debate about visions for African American freedom in the late 1800s and a little bit into the early 1900s. And there's an argument to be made that these are the two most important African American social thinkers and advocates for rights in American history. And judging by how much the APUSH exam has referred to them or given opportunities to refer to them in the past, it's pretty clear that the writers of the APUSH exam seem to think that these are the two most important thinkers. You're much more likely to get a question about, or an opportunity to talk about, one of these two men rather than someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael or something like that. So it's important to keep them in mind and to very much understand how they are different in their positions on African American rights. Moving on to the labor movement, we know that the first major national union had been the Knights of Labor, but that they had disintegrated after the Haymarket Square riot. They're going to be essentially replaced as a major national union by the American Federation of Labor. And the American Federation of Labor sought more limited labor goals rather than the broad reforms like the Knights of Labor had. The American Federation of Labor was led by a man named Samuel Gompers, and it was an alliance of skilled craft workers, meaning that it was not as inclusive as the Knights of Labor had been, because they had welcomed both skilled and unskilled, whereas the AFL only welcomes skilled craft workers. They excluded unskilled workers, they excluded African Americans, they excluded women, and they excluded immigrants, because Gompers essentially didn't believe these people were able to be organized in the labor movement, and he didn't really think that they were necessarily entitled to the rights that they were advocating for. The AFL also differed from the Knights of Labor in that they were more willing to work with management through negotiation rather than strikes like the Knights of Labor favored using. And the AFL concentrated on, quote, bread and butter, end quote, issues like higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions, not the broad economic and social reforms like the Knights of Labor had advocated for. And by the way, if you ever see those terms bread and butter or bread and butter issues, you can be sure that whatever source you're looking at is referring to the AFL. So sometimes trigger words can help put you on the right path to understanding a primary source. Finally, women exerted a growing influence on public affairs during the late 1800s, and this is based on that concept of social housekeeping that we talked about before, which was based on the assumption of women having a moralizing influence, which itself is based on the traditions of Republican motherhood or the cult of domesticity. This will be more important, and we'll talk about this more during the Progressive Era, which is in period 7, but nonetheless, the idea is important in understanding how these movements get started. The most important organization to talk about in terms of women's growing influence on public affairs in the late 1800s is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was formed in 1874, and it became the largest, most influential women's organization in the country. And it focused, of course, on temperance, or reducing the amount of alcohol that people consumed. And this traces its tradition back to, period 4, the early 1800s, when we saw that temperance was one of those early reform movements. And this was a women's movement because women that were temperance advocates, I should say, tended to blame most social evils like poverty, spousal abuse, child abuse, divorce, etc., on over-consuming alcohol. Now, as the WCTU was an important, influential, and well-respected national organization, when it would change its platform, that was important and politicians took notice. So when Frances Willard, the head of the WCTU, moved the organization from simply prohibition to calls for broader economic and political reform, including women's suffrage, that is a major step for the women's rights movement, and it's going to help propel the women's rights movement to the issue of women's suffrage to ultimately gain that amendment to the Constitution in period 7, which we'll talk about then, in 1920.